Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about finding the greatest common factor. Before we jump into that, let's talk about dividing. So 12x plus 9 divided by 3. So notice there's two things on top of a binomial on top, and I'm dividing by this 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate this. I'm going to take 12x, divide it by 3, and then I'm going to take my 9 and divide it by 3. So I'm going to rewrite it just like this. All right, now I'm going to simplify. Well, 12x divided by 3, 12 divided by 3 is 4, so I know that will give me a 4x. I know 9 divided by 3 is going to give me a positive 3. So I just simplified it. All right, on B, I'm going to take each of these on top, and I'm going to divide by this 5x. So I'm going to separate it. And simplify. So I have, first of all, I'm going to look at my coefficients and then I'll look at my variables. 15 divided by 5 is 3. I have x to the third divided by x to the 1. So remember, I have more x's on top, and the way we do that is I know one of these guys on the bottom will cancel one of these from the top, so we subtract. 3 minus 1 is 2. Okay, so positive 10 divided by 5 is going to give me a positive 2. X squared on top, x to the 1 on the bottom. I know one of these will cancel one of these, so 2 minus 1 is x to the first, so you don't have to put your 1 exponent. Finally, a positive 20 divided by 5 is a positive 4. I know this single x on top will cancel this single x on bottom. All right, so I'm going to separate each one of these. All right, so I'm going to look at my coefficients first. 14 divided by negative 7 is a negative 2. I don't have any y's on the bottom, so that y squared will just drop. I have negative 21 divided by a negative 7. That's going to give me a positive 3. There are no y's on the bottom, so this y just drops. And finally, a 7 divided by a negative 7 is a negative 1. All right, last one. I'm going to take each of these 3 on top and divide it by negative 2x. Okay, first group. I have 18 divided by a negative 2. That's going to give me a negative 9. I see x's on top being divided by x's on bottom. That's x to the fourth on top, x to the first. So I know one of these guys will cancel one of these on top. So 4 minus 1 is 3, so that's x to the third. I have a positive 18 divided by a negative 2. That's going to give me a negative 9. X squared on top, x to the first on bottom. 2 minus 1 is 1, so that's x to the first power. No reason to put the 1, but you can if you want. And then finally, I have negative 12x divided by negative 2x. Negative 12 divided by negative 2 is a positive 6. This single x on top will cancel out the single x on bottom. Okay, so this practice, what we just did, is going to help us factor out our greatest common factor. So really what each of these on the bottom were our greatest common factor of each of the tops. So negative 7 was the greatest common factor out of this guy. And what we're going to do is end up factoring it out. So that was just like a little mini lesson up front to help us figure out what we're going to be doing next. Okay, so find the greatest common factor of each of the following. Okay, so before we factor anything out, we're just going to figure out what is the greatest common factor. Okay, so the greatest common factor is the greatest thing your 2 or 3 or however many groups you have has in common. Okay, so remember x to the fifth means x times x times x times x times x. X to the third means x times x times x. So I want to find the greatest thing that these two groups have in common. Well, I know that this group has x to the third, and this group also has an x to the third. So I know they both have an x to the third, so their greatest common factor is x to the third. Alright, this guy means x times x times y times y times y. I'm going to put this one here on the bottom just so there's room. That means x times x times x times x times x times y times y. So I want to figure out what is the greatest thing they both have in common. Well, I know this one has 2x's being multiplied and 2x's being multiplied. This one has 2y's being multiplied and 2y's being multiplied. So the greatest thing they have in common is x times x, which is x squared. And they have y times y in common, which is y squared. Okay, so on these two examples, we didn't have any coefficients. We just had the variables. On this next few problems, we're going to have coefficients and variables that we have to pay attention to. So I have to find the greatest number that goes into 22 and 66. If 1 is the only number that goes into both of them, you don't really count 1 because 1 goes into everything. Okay, so I'm going to show you a calculator trick. And it only works for 2 numbers, so when we get to 3 over here, we're going to have to play with it a little more, and I'll show you when we get there. So I want to find the biggest number that goes into 22 and 66. So I'm going to go to my calculator. I'm going to press Menu, Number, Greatest Common Divisor. And I'm going to type in my 2 numbers. The first one was 22, and then I'm going to put a comma and type in my second number. So I know this is going to tell me the greatest number that goes into both of those. So 22 goes into 22. 22 also goes into 66. All right, this one has m squared. This one has m to the third. Okay, so I know that this one has an m times m. This one also has an m times m. So I know they also have an m squared in common. So their greatest common factor is 22 m squared. All right, so on D, I need to figure out what is the greatest common factor of 28 and 42. So I'm going to use my calculator to help me out. So I press Menu, Number, Greatest Common Divisor, and my 2 numbers are 28, comma, 42. So it tells me that 14 is the greatest number that will go into 28 and 42. So 14. All right, so now let's look at our variables. I see this one has c to the third. This one also has c to the third, so I know they both have c to the third in common. This one has d squared. This one has no variable of a d at all, so they do not have d in common at all. So I can't put it as a common factor. They don't both have it, so they don't have d in common. See that this one has an e over here, e squared, but this one does not, so e is not in common either, so I have to stop here. All they have is 14c to the third in common. Okay, so now I'm trying to find the greatest common factor between these 3 different groups. So the bad thing about the calculator is the calculator will only do 2 numbers at a time, so you might have to play with it. I like to start with the smallest and the biggest number, but you're going to have to check to make sure it goes into your third number. So my numbers are 75, 150, my coefficients. All right, so I'm going to go to my calculator, and I'm going to use the small and the big number, so 50 and 100. Menu, Number, Greatest Common Divisor. So I'm going to type in my smallest number, which is 50, comma, my largest number, which is 100. So I know it tells me 50 goes into 50, 50 goes into 100, but I have to check, does 50 also go into 75, which was my third number? Well, 50 does not go into 75, so I know that's not going to work. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try my biggest 2 numbers, and it really doesn't matter as long as you play with it until you find a number that works for all of them, okay? So then I'm going to try my biggest 2 numbers, so 75 and 100. Menu, Number, Greatest Common Divisor, 75, comma, 100. It tells me the biggest number that goes in each of those is 25. 25 goes into 75 and 100. So let's go check. Does 25 go into my third number? Does 25 go into 50? Yes, twice. 2 quarters, right? So 25 is the largest number that goes into 75, 150. And I'm sure a lot of you could have done that in your head, and that's fine, but I just wanted to show you how you can use the calculator as a tool to help you get there. All right, so now let's look at my variable of x. See, it has x's here, x's here, x's here. So I need to find the greatest amount that they all have. So this one has x to the 5th, this one has x to the 3rd. Okay, so I know they can't have x to the 5th in common because this one doesn't have 5. So let's see, x to the 3rd. This one has x to the 2nd. All right, so I know they all have at least x to the 2nd in common. All right, now let's look at y's. I see y's here, here, and y's here, so they have y's in common. So I have to figure out what is the greatest number they all have. So y squared, y to the 4th, y to the 3rd. Well, you're looking pretty much for your smallest one. I know they all have at least y to the 2nd power in common. And now let's look at z's. I see z's here, here, and here, so they all have z's in common. This is z to the 1st, 3rd, and 4th. So I know they all at least have one z in common. All right, so that's how you find your greatest common factor. All right, so then we're going to work on factoring out our greatest common factor. So this is pretty much what we're doing. So if I look at 4x minus 8, I know the greatest common factor between 4x and a negative 8 is 4. 4 goes into 4, 4 goes into 8. Okay, I know they do not have an x in common. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out that that greatest common factor. And the way we're going to do that is, whatever our greatest common factor is, I'm going to take my two groups and divide by 4, kind of like we did at the beginning. So divide this one by 4, divide this one by 4. Well, I know 4 divided by 4 is 1, and I'm left with my x. That's where this 1x came in. Negative 8 divided by 4 is a negative 2. That's where this came in. So after we divide by our greatest common factor, this is what we get, and then you just stick your greatest common factor out front. All right, so let's just jump into some examples. All right, step 1, find the greatest common factor. After we find the greatest common factor, then we're going to divide each of these by whatever that greatest common factor is, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so 10 and 30, so if you want to, you can use a calculator. Many of you can do that in your head. So again, type in your two numbers. So the greatest common factor is 10 between those two numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and write that my GCF is 10. And now I'm going to look for my variables. Well, this one has an x, this one does not, so I know they can't have x in common. So the only thing they have in common is this 10. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide each one of those by 10. Okay, so I know 10 divided by 10 is 1, those cancel, but my x is still there. I know 30 divided by 10 is a positive 3. Okay, so whenever I divide each of these by my greatest common factor, I get x plus 3. But we're going to put our greatest common factor that we pulled out, that we divided everything by, out front here. So my greatest common factor is a 10. So 10x plus 30 is the same thing as 10 times x plus 3. If I would distribute, I would get this same thing. But all we did was find the greatest common factor and pulled it out. All right, let's try this one. I'm going to find my greatest common factor. So 50 and 75. It tells me my greatest common factor is a 25. So now we're going to look at our variables. I see x's here, I see x's here. Well, they each have an x, and they each have at least one x. So my greatest common factor is 25x. So now I need to take each one of these groups and divide by 25x. Negative 75x divided by 25x. Okay, well I know 50 divided by 25 is a 2. I know x squared divided by x to the first is just an x because 2 minus 1 is 1. Negative 75 divided by 25 is a negative 3. The single x on top cancels that single x on bottom. Oops, I don't mean to box that in. All right, so whenever I divide each of these by my greatest common factor, I'm left with 2x minus 3. And we can't forget to put our greatest common factor out front. All right, so let's find my greatest common factor. So between 34 and 51, tells me my greatest common factor is a 17. So now I look at my variables. I see x is here, I see x is here, I see that they both have at least 1. So my greatest common factor is 17x. So I take each one of these, and I'm going to divide by 17x. Well, 34 divided by 17 is a 2. X squared divided by x to the first is x to the first, because 2 minus 1 is 1. Sorry guys, I'll be right back. I'm back. Okay, so we did 34 divided by 17 is 2. X squared divided by x to the first is x, because 2 minus 1 is 1. Okay, we have a positive 51 divided by 17. That's going to give me a positive 3. And I have an x on top, cancels that x on bottom, so that cancels. All right, so I know whenever I divided each of these by my greatest common factor, I got 2x plus 3. And I can't forget to put my greatest common factor out front. Okay, so we're going to find the greatest common factor first. So there's 3 of them, so remember we're going to have to play with it. I like to start with the smallest and the biggest number, so I'm going to go put in 3 and 27. Menu, number, greatest common divisor, 3 and 27. It tells me 3, so I have to make sure that 3 goes into that third number. Does 3 go into 12? Yes, it does. So 3. Then I have to check for variables. I see A's here, but this guy does not have an A, so they do not all have A in common. So I have to stop at 3. So I'm going to take each one of these and divide by 3. Okay, well, a 3 divided by 3 gives me a 1, so I know those 3's cancel, so A squared drops down. 12 divided by 3 gives me a positive 4, and my A will drop down. And then finally, negative 27 divided by 3 is a negative 9. So this is what I get when I divide each of these by the greatest common factor. So to get my final answer, I put it in parentheses, and remember to put my greatest common factor out front. Okay, so let's find the greatest common factor. So it's 3 numbers, so I like to try the smallest and the largest. So I'm going to try 5 and 30. I did not mean to click that. Menu, number, greatest common divisor. I'm typing in 5 and 30. So it tells me 5, so I have to make sure 5 goes into that third number. So 5 goes into 5, 5 goes into 30. Yes, 5 does go into 15. So now I have to look at my variables. I see A's here, here, and here. They all have A's, so I need to figure out how much they all have at least. So to the third, to the second, to the first, so I know they all have at least one A. Then I look at my variable B. I see B's here, here, and here. To the second, to the third, to the first, so I know they at least have one B. So my greatest common factor is 5AB, so that's what I'm going to divide each of these groups by. All right, let's simplify. 30 divided by 5 is a 6. I have a to the third divided by a to the first, so I know I subtract. That's going to give me a to the 3 minus 1 is 2. I have b to the second divided by b to the first, so I subtract. 2 minus 1 is 1, and we don't have to put the 1. Next, negative 15 divided by 5 is a negative 3. I have a to the second divided by a to the first, which is going to give me a to the first because 2 minus 1 is 1. I have b to the third divided by b to the first, so that's going to give me b to the second because 3 minus 1 is 2. All right, last group. Negative 5 divided by 5 is a negative 1. And notice this AB on top will cancel this AB that's on bottom. All right, so I know we put our greatest common factor out front. And in parentheses, we're going to put what we got when we divided everything by the greatest common factor. Boom. Okay, so we're going to find my greatest common factor. Oops, sorry guys. So I look at my coefficients first. This is a 6, a 7, and a 1. Okay, so anytime you have where it looks like there is no coefficient or you know there's a 1 there, you don't have to worry about it because 1 is the only number that will go into 1. And we don't really count 1 because 1 goes into everything. So 6, 7, and 1. So I don't have to worry about it. All right, so now look at x's. I see x's here, here, and here. So that's x to the fourth, x to the third, and x to the first. They all have at least one x. Then I look at y's. I see y's here, here, and here. Y to the fifth, y to the second, y to the first. They all have at least one y. So I'm going to divide everything by my xy. Okay, my 6 will drop down. I have x to the fourth divided by x to the first will give me x to the third because 4 minus 1 is 3. Y to the fifth divided by y to the first will give me y to the fourth because 5 minus 1 is 4. This negative 7 will drop down. X to the third divided by x to the first will give me x to the second because 3 minus 1 is 2. Y to the second divided by y to the first will give me y to the first because 2 minus 1 is 1. Okay, this part right here I have a lot of students get confused on because we see that this xy cancels out this xy, and that's true. But let's pretend. Let's say let's put a regular number there instead. What if it said negative 5 divided by a positive 5? Instead of saying negative xy divided by a positive xy. Well, we know this easily. Negative 5 divided by 5 is a negative 1. Well, this is the same idea. Yeah, these cancel, but I still have a negative 1. All right, so I'm going to put my greatest common factor out front. And in parentheses, I'm going to put what I got when I divided everything by my greatest common factor. And that's everything. Bye, y'all.